Welcome to Echoes in the Gallery. I'm your host, Susan L. Sistrunk, a lifelong artist and educator of the arts. Last week, in Episode 2, we explored the history of Stephan Ivanov. Tonight, during Episode 3, The Unexpected, we meet a mysterious stranger with a connection to all our cast members. Let us step into the gallery and begin. Episode 3, The Unexpected. From across the street, Turia watched as Stephan walked into his office on California Avenue. She had finally found him. It had taken a long time, but she had finally found him. Her green eyes clouded over. Golden brown, curly hair swirled around her 25-year-old face. He must have known he couldn't hide from her forever. What was he thinking for the last 10 years? Did he honestly think she wouldn't track him down? Turia pulled out her cell phone and dialed. The line clicked open, and she heard her brother's voice come forward. "Well?" Sergei asked. "It's him. I told you I would find him. It just took a little digging." Turia could hear the relief in Sergei's sigh, and she smiled. For the last decade, they'd been looking for Stephan. And he couldn't have known. He must have thought the two of them would simply let the entire matter go. Not a chance. Stephan Ivanov had made an absolute and obscene fortune selling art which belonged to other people. Statues, paintings, prints, tapestries. His lust for art knew no bounds. He sold on the black market and did not care where it was shipped to or from, as long as he acquired what he wanted. He also had no scruples about who he crossed in the process. Well, this time he would care. She would make sure of it. The last 10 years of tracking him down had given her a steely resolve. As she sat in her car looking toward the bay, Turia realized she must proceed with caution. This was no time to get sloppy. Sergei broke the silence first. "What are you going to do?" he whispered nervously. "Nothing yet," she said with determination. "Nothing!" Sergei exclaimed. "What are you thinking?" She could hear his rage boiling over. Of the two of them, he had never understood the need for patience in this scenario. "What about everything he did to us?" Turia cut him off. "I know, Sergei. That is why we need patience. If we act with haste, all will be lost. Trust me. We must act with caution." Sergei sighed. "Fine, but let's not wait too long. This has gone on long enough, and he needs to pay." Turia closed her eyes and breathed deeply. "Don't worry," she whispered. "He will pay." Sergei looked at the phone for a moment. His sister needed to keep focus. Turia, for all her good qualities, still harbored some amount of feelings for Ivanov. She was interested in stealing Ivanov's money. He was interested in revenge. Stephan Ivanov had taken everything from Sergei and Turia. Sergei had seen his sister devastated and in tears as a direct result of his actions. Their lives shattered by the greed and emotional blackmail placed upon them by a tyrant. So many others had also suffered at the whims of this man. Oh yes, Sergei thought, he will most definitely pay. Turia sat for an hour watching his office. During that time, she saw two men walk into the building. A short while after, they walked out the front door with Stephan. Turia could only assume that these were his men. She would need to find an excuse to enter the building while he is away and get into his office and computer. Hopefully, Sergei could hold it together while accessing the accounts. He had a tendency to become hot-headed. Turia opened her car door and walked towards the door of the office building. The clear glass doors gave a view of the receptionist inside. Opening the door, Turia smiled her brightest and with her heels softly clicking on the polished granite floor, approached the stern-looking woman behind the desk. The nameplate on the high cubicle wall read Mrs. Watson. She looked to be about 70 years old and had the look of a guard dog with her coiffed hair and bifocals. Oh boy, Turia thought, this will be interesting. "Hello," Turia cheerfully greeted her. Mrs. Watson glanced up from her book. The cover gave a vague impression that the plot must contain some sort of lust in the jungle theme, and her face gave the impression she was not happy to be interrupted. "And how may I help you?" Her icy stare left no room for error on Turia's part. "I'm interested in renting some office space, and your building was recommended by an acquaintance of mine, Mr. Ivanov. Is he here? I would love a tour of his office space." Keeping eye contact and a smile, she waited calmly. Mrs. Watson looked at her with suspicion until hearing Mr. Ivanov's name. Her face softened somewhat. Still wary, but a bit less now. "You know Mr. Ivanov? What is your name?" Mrs. Watson asked. Miss Jacobs, Tutoria answered confidently, looking at Miss Watson firmly in the eye. Our families are old friends, and when he heard I was moving to the city and needed some office space, he recommended this building. Is he here? Mrs. Watson still looked uncertain, but Tutoria could tell she was softening. He actually just left, but I could see about having someone give you a tour of some of the empty office spaces if you would like. That would be wonderful. Tutoria smiled brightly at Miss Jacobs. In 10 minutes, there was an assistant named Ted leading her around the building. While speaking with Miss Watson, Tutoria had looked at the marquee directory in the library, and she knew that Ivanov was on the 10th floor. I would love to see something higher up, she smiled at the young man, who was probably still in college and took this job as a side gig. He looked pretty young and impressionable. What can I say? I have a thing for heights. Tutoria looked up at him and flirtatiously smiled. Men were so easy. Sure, he stammered, and they got back on the elevator. She looked coyly up at him from the side as they waited for the doors to open. As they walked around the 10th floor with the massive windows overlooking the Bay Area, Tutoria kept her eyes open for Office 5C. Of course it was a corner. I love this one, she exclaimed excitedly. Well, this one is currently being leased by Mr. Ivanov, Ted blushed, looking away from her. Oh, yeah, this is going well, Tutoria thought, smiling back at him. We do have this office next to him available, and it still has a pretty good view of the bay. Want to take a look? Ted nervously fumbled with his key. Walking in, she noticed the shared wall between this office and Ivanov's were the same wall where his desk was located, with his computer. This would work nicely. Sergei needed a close range. I assume internet access is provided? Oh, yes, ma'am, he stammered. Ted couldn't stop staring into this woman's eyes. Who was she? She was so exotic-looking, the way her curly hair cascaded down her shoulders. He just drifted off, looking into her eyes. Ted? Ted? He was suddenly thrust out of his reverie and felt the heat rising to his face. Tutoria smiled softly. Too easy, she thought again. I'll take it. It's absolutely perfect for what I need. An hour later, she had her deposit paid, lease signed, and called Sergei to organize the movers. After completing the paperwork, she went upstairs again and looked around. Yes, this would do very nicely. Across town, Gwen got out of her car and walked to her apartment, mind reeling. She had worked late and it was dark outside. Jordan had asked so many questions today, and she had not a single answer to give him which wouldn't put him at risk. The more she dodged his questions, the more inquisitive he had become. What was she going to do? Gwen already knew his eyes full of curiosity would be waiting for her in the morning. As the key turned in the latch, she realized how tired she was of this whole thing. Walking inside, she dropped her keys on the table and stopped short. Her breath caught in her throat and her stomach lurched with fear. The painting was gone. That was the last thought before a hand clamped over her mouth. She smelled something chemical, and the world went dark. This concludes Episode 3 of Echoes in the Gallery, The Unexpected. Join us next week for Episode 4, The Fear, where we will discover what has become of Gwen and delve deeper into the abyss of what Gwen and Jonathan are actually up to. Until then, stay safe and love each other.